All right, guys, for those of you joining us online, we are live in Chicago. I've got with me Pastor Tommy Thompson. He's going to be sharing our thought today. Any of you guys have something that you want to comment into the chat or into the room, you can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand and we'll do what we did last week in Tampa. His talk today is entitled, Does Your Church Need Revitalization? And so we've got a roundtable format today, a room full of people that are here with us. And so thank you guys for joining us online. I'm going to turn it over to Tommy.
Well, welcome to everybody here live and in person, and those of you that are joining us at the weekly roundtable as well. And this session is part of our revitalization track. This will be the final breakout session for the day. And we're talking about church revitalization, and really what the question I want us all to ask ourselves today is, does your church need revitalization? So as we get started in this session today, and I'm afraid you guys online don't have the handout, but I'll be pretty much following along verbatim. I have the exact same handout as everybody else in the room, but I just want to work our way through this because I want to make sure that once I kind of go through this information that I have, I want to leave plenty of time for dialogue and plenty of time for just some good, healthy conversation. I'm also blessed. You heard sessions earlier in the revitalization track from Dr. Scott Foshi and also Dr. Tim Rodas, who are here. And I'm glad they're sitting in on this roundtable today because they too can add their expertise to the conversation. So with those two guys in the room, there's always going to be some great conversation. But so it's a very basic question, and it's not really complicated to answer either. Does your church need revitalization? Well, I don't want to go into a lot of statistics and stuff like that, but just real quickly, you've heard this statistic. Everybody knows this statistic. It comes from Tom Rainer. 8 out of 10 churches, 80% need revitalization. Now, one statistic you may not have heard is that since the pandemic, that statistic has actually increased. And I referenced the article here, and I have it resourced on the back page, but he did another article on March the 1st, and it was entitled Major New Research on Declining, Plateaued, and Growing Churches from Exponential and Lifeway Research. And in that article, he says that now, post-pandemic, 9 out of 10 churches need revitalization. So I mean, if we don't go any further than that research alone, how would you answer the question, does your church need revitalization? So the bottom line is, out of all of us sitting in this room, probably none of us would say we don't, but statistically speaking, only a handful of you in this entire room would not need church revitalization. So I wrote an article about a year ago on this subject of the need of church revitalization, and I made a statement. I just threw it in the notes here as a quote, that I personally believe that church revitalization is the greatest need for 21st century Christianity. Churches are closing at a much faster rate than we are planting churches. And you add to that the COVID pandemic over the last couple of years, and it has only exacerbated the problem tenfold. So again, statistically speaking, your church needs some level of church revitalization. So as we talk about revitalization and how do we assess whether or not our churches need revitalization, I make this statement, and Dr. Scott Foshi touched on this earlier in his session, and I wasn't in Tim's, but I'm sure Tim probably touched on it as well. And that is that to ascertain whether your church needs revitalization, it requires assessment. It requires assessment. And there's a biblical theology to this. I love the book of Nehemiah. I've preached through the book over the years. And when it comes to church revitalization, as Scott said earlier in his sessions, Nehemiah was one of the great Old Testament revitalizers. He was the overseer that led the initiative of revitalization in the city of Jerusalem, as recorded in the book of Nehemiah. So as we look at that story, that narrative there in the book of Nehemiah, we find Nehemiah that is called of God, And we know that he's a strong overseer. He's a strong spiritual leader that goes back, and God gave him this burden to revitalize the city and rebuild the city, rebuild the walls and all of the things that were going on there. And I've often said that the key to his success was because he began with an honest assessment. And in my experience, those who lead the best revitalization initiatives are those who begin, like Nehemiah, with a very raw, a very real, what I like to call a brutally honest assessment of where you really are. Not the flowered, optimistic version of where you are, but the reality of it. The nasty, dirty, filthy reality of where your church actually is. Because often, you know how it is. You get in a pastor's fellowship, how are things going? Oh, things are going great. How's it going? Oh, it couldn't be better. And you just wrote your resignation out the day before secretly, you know. So it's not that flowery version, but it's the reality. And look, the bottom line is there's no such thing as a perfect church, right? There's no such thing as a perfect church. And every church has areas of that are unhealthy. And so in revitalization, church revitalization is not just for those going into a troubled or dysfunctional, declining, plateaued church, trying to turn it around. We all have some assessment of unhealth in our local congregations. And so all of us at some level need to be looking and leading a certain level of revitalization. It may be a micro revitalization within a certain area of your church, or it could be a worst case scenario where you're in a declining or a plateaued or declining or dying church and you need a full scale. But regardless of it, it requires honest assessment. So as we look at this story of Nehemiah specifically, and I'm just giving you a little theological pinning here before we jump into to some of the assessment metrics. But I like to point out these things about the life of Nehemiah as the lead revitalizer in this narrative. Number one, we see that he sought direction from the Lord. And I love, even before he gets back to Jerusalem, he is already, I love what Scott said earlier, Nehemiah was prayed up because he was the cupbearer. You know, he never knew when his last drink was going to be his next drink was going to be his last. So he had a good prayer life. But he did. He had a good prayer life. He had a walk with God. And that's where real revitalization begins. I've been in conferences, I've been in prior idea conferences before in a setting just like this. And someone asked a question about leading change in their church. And I made a comment. I said, what kind of change and why are you trying to lead that? And really what came out in the conversation is that he was just trying to move the culture of the church from the church's set of preferences to his set of preferences. That's not gospel-driven change. That's just putting aside someone else. That's actually, let's be honest about it, in the grand scheme of things, that's a very selfish motive. That just means you're wanting to go in because you want your kind of music and you want your kind of leadership and you want your kind of style, culture in the church. That's not the position we should be leading revitalization from, right? So if we really want to lead our churches to become healthy, we need to go to God and ask God, what is a healthy church? And we just have gone through a few different series of messages on that here at Ashburn in the last couple of years, and I'm sure I'll lead several more where we talk about what does a healthy church look like. And every time we have that conversation as a church, we go back to the Bible. We don't look to the latest trends. We don't look to what other churches are doing. We go back to the Bible and say, here's what we think God is leading us to do as a church. And so that begins with direction from the Lord. And I love this. I jotted this down in our notes here. If you're going to lead revitalization, it requires, number one, being prayerful and open to God's leadership. Don't try to lead change in your church unless it's God-led, right? God initiated and God-led. The worst thing you could do is just try to push change on your people without the backing of God on it, right? I mean, that's a split. That's a church split waiting to happen. Being broken over the church's needs, not trying to push change because you want to be hyped like the next church down the road, but leading change because you see this gap this gospel gap in the ministry and the direction of your church, and you're trying to realign with that. You're trying to realign with the gospel mission, and you find that by God's leadership. Number 3, having wisdom for God's direction. Sometimes God will give you direction, but he also gives you the timing for that. He'll say, this is where I want you to go, but not right now. I want you to put the pause on until I deal with some other issues, and then you can move forward. And I've done that dozens of times just in the last 3 years here at Ashburn. There's things I wanted to do. I know God wanted me to do, but I knew the timing wasn't right. And so we just had to be still, let God be God. And when God gave the green light, then we moved on those things. So having that wisdom is so important. It's not only knowing what to do, it's knowing when to do it, in other words. Number 4, having courage to challenge the real issues. There's no doubt what we see here in Nehemiah's life, specifically in the opening chapters of verse number 3, having courage. He went to his king and asked for permission. Not only did he go to a secular, godless king and say, this is what I want to do. He said, this is what God's hand upon me is to do. I mean, he invoked his faith into a secular, hedonistic God for favor to go back and rebuild a religious institution, for lack of better words. So he had a great courage. Number 5, having conviction about God's new plan for the church. We see that in chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. And then number 6, being clear in your communication to the church as you share the vision. That's what we find Nehemiah doing when he finally does all the surveying, the assessment, and he goes back to the people. He goes to their leader, the elders first, their leadership, and shares that vision and mission with them. And then they go to the broader people and says, let us rise up and build. And obviously he was effective as a visionary leader, an overseer, and God used him to lead successful revitalization. I mean, we know the whole story, right? He was successful. He did all that work in 52 days flat, which is astonishing at the very least. So revitalization begins with assessment, and that assessment begins by seeking direction from God. Number 2, it continues with the actual assessment. And that's what we see in Nehemiah chapter number 2. We see Nehemiah surveying the walls, the gates, and then we see thirdly, the third part of that assessment is mission and vision. He goes to the people and he casts the vision. He tells them what the mission is. God's hand is upon me to rebuild the city. Very clear, very simple, very straightforward. But because it's compelling, because they're able to see it, because he communicates it in a way that they can see it and grasp it and view it as achievable, they said, let us rise up and build. They answered, they responded to that call. And then in chapter 3, you see the strategy. I literally just preached this last Sunday in our church, how the Bible says, and next unto him, and next unto him, and next unto him. You find that unity. The message I preached here was unity is the key to fulfilling God's mission. And so we see in chapter 3, next to him and next to him. And so Nehemiah is successfully leading and executing this strategy. Now, I want to give you kind of a case study to kind of make all this make sense in the context. And I don't know all of your situations and what your current context is but I do mine because I've been leading through it for the last 3 years. And if you were in any of the other revitalization sessions with Tim Rodas or Scott Foshee, they shared a lot of this refocus path, the 6-step process. Our church is actually going through that process now. And so we've been working through this. We've been working through the assessment process, what we call the discovery process. And so we've been going through this 6-step revitalization process known as Refocus, which is a pathway for church health and renewal offered by Corpus Vitae. I include the link there. And as a part of our discovery process, our church completed a 10-part discovery questionnaire to assess our church's need for revitalization by synthesizing some data and developing a list of what we call 5 top core discoveries, about our church, about Ashburn, in other words. Some of those areas we assessed included worship, discipleship, leadership, and evangelism. Now, there's another resource that we use in that process, and that's the discovery process is not what I want to talk about today. Today, in the remaining time that I have, I want to talk to you about what we call the vision receptivity assessment. This is an assessment that we offer to churches as part of the assessment process for them to answer questions about themselves and assess themselves as a church to come to a place to understand where they are in the receptiveness of revitalization. In other words, how open they are to leading change in and through their church. So this we call it VRA for short, Vision Receptivity Assessment. It's designed to help evaluate the receptiveness of existing church cultures to the new vision that the leadership is trying to cast. So there's 9 categories. So we led our church through this, and I want you to ask yourself the question, does your church need revitalization, as we look through these 9 different areas? So what I've done is I've listed the 9 areas, and then I've listed, there are about 10, I believe about 10 questions. Is that right, Scott? Tim, about 10 questions. I listed 3 briefly, and I'm not going to elaborate on these. I just want to move through this. You can make notes and prep some questions for the conversation later if you want to, but I just want to quickly move through this, and you just be thinking, does this affect my church? Is this where I am? Is this, yeah, boy, this really, and just kind of make some notes to yourself as you are asking yourself the question, does my church need revitalization? So if you're watching online, maybe just jot down some notes as well. So the first area of receptivity is on mission versus religious activity. In other words, is my church living on mission with the Great Commission, or are we engaged in just religious activity? We all should hopefully understand that busier is not better, right? Most churches that are in need of revitalization are very busy, meaning that they are way over programmed because they've come to an unhealthy place where they've convinced themselves that as long as they're busy, as long as their calendar is full, as long as they're doing things, they're healthy. But how many of you know that's just not true? You can be doing a million things in a church. And I've been a part of a church that was super, super busy. We had a college, Christian school. I was the associate pastor. I administrated the school. I was also the VP of the college. I mean, I was involved up to here every day, working, 10, 12, 14, 16 hours days. And we were so far off mission. We were so religious in our activity, and yet we weren't accomplishing anything for the gospel's sake. So on mission versus religious activity. So here's some questions you should ask yourself as you look at this. Number 1, church members and staff know why each aspect of the church's ministry is important. Why do we have an Awana program? Why do we have this particular ministry? Why do we have the ladies quilt knitting ministry? Is it important? Why is it important? Number 2, church members and staff understand their common purpose. Number 3, church members and staff know what other church members do, and again, why it is important to the church. So this is some of the questions you can ask yourself to determine whether or not you are an on-mission church or an activity, a religious activity versus religious activity. And you might even want to do a scale of 1 to 10, 0 is way off mission. 10 is closer to being on mission, because you may have some things right, but not everything right. So you may need some revitalization. Number 2 area is courage versus fear. Courage versus fear. One of the questions you ask yourself is, the church is hopeful about its future. Now, most pastors and most churches, especially churches that need a revitalization, are not hopeful about their future. Matter of fact, they feel like they're desperately hanging on by a thread. And they feel like at any moment they're ready to write out their resignation, or the doors of the church are ready to close. Or they're just one church split or one catastrophe away from being no more. So the church easily overcomes those fears. And it has about changes that it needs to make. Truth is, most churches aren't. They're not optimistic. They're not hopeful. They're easily overcome by fear about the thought of changing anything of the least significance. Because most of you know, if you've gone in that kind of context before, you just move the wrong flower pot and you're going to get railed on. You clean a little bit and you're going to get railed on. I mean, we got in trouble when I first got here just for cleaning out closets, just for cleaning out stairwells that should have been empty in the first place. And so that, there's all kinds of stuff that you can get in trouble for. But what are you going to do? Are you going to shrink back in fear? Or are you going to call 3 more dumpsters and move on for Jesus? Amen. So courage, it requires courage, obviously. Number 3, trust versus distrust. A lot of churches have been hurt and burned through, rollover of leadership over the years, that there's a distrust. And now you come in as the new guy. You're like the 4th or 5th guy in line, and your church has gone through a decade or maybe even 2 decades of failed leadership. And now you want to move forward, but every time you try to, you hear a story. And that story is filled with distrust. That story is filled with pain and hurt. And you're just not sure you'll ever be able to rebuild that trust. And so here's some questions to ask yourself. Lies and deception and half-truths are quickly confronted and challenged. Or do you just turn a blind eye and a deaf ear and pretend like you didn't hear it? Church members trust the decisions the positions of authority are making. Disrespectful people are confronted, and their behavior is expected to change. In one of the lost scriptural principles in church revitalization is church discipline. And none of us want to do it. I had never done church discipline until I came to Ashburn. And I've done my gutful of it since I've been here. And I had to muster up all the strength and the courage in my heart to be able to move forward on it. And I can tell you some horror stories. We don't have time. I did several initially, and they all failed. In other words, we voted to remove them, and they passed the vote and stayed in the membership. You talk about taking any faith out of the future, man. It robbed me. I mean, I was fetal for like 2 weeks after that, just trying to regain my composure and my strength and even the desire at that point to try to move the church forward. Number 4, authentic communication versus withheld information. Boy, a dangerous thing to have in your church culture, and it will destroy any attempt at church revitalization, is a lack of transparency, a lack of authenticity. And so some of the questions you need to ask is, there is honest conversation about the church's ministry and mission among church family. Is that true in your church? Or do you hold things back for fear? Or do you hold things back because it will hurt you or hurt the church? There's a willingness to honestly talk about the issues. Gossip is considered a sin and addressed quickly. Or is it running so rampant, so much and so often, so frequently, that it just seems like it's out of control, and you feel like you could never get a grip on it and deal with it. Number 5, clarity versus chaos. Church members readily set aside their agendas in order to join themselves for a greater purpose. Oh, that's revival. Amen. Yeah. I mean, if people actually laid aside their own differences and preferences and said, hey, we want what God wants for this church. I mean, you'd have revival and revitalization breaking out all over the place. Another thought is the church is unwilling to allow disorder, instead seeks to understand what to do and how to do it. This is where visionary overseer leadership is so important. Strong, courageous leadership that is willing to address the problems with courage and to confront the haters and the scorners and those that are going to try to hinder or thwart what you know God is leading you to do. So clarity versus chaos. That's where you have to step in and lead with clarity. How do you overcome chaos? By making things clear and by stepping out and not letting everybody guess what you're thinking, but you leading out. By the way, if you're ashamed to say whatever you lead, change you want to lead, you probably shouldn't lead that kind of change in the first place. Because common sense and the gospel always wins. If your change you're trying to lead is gospel centric, the people will love it and want it. But if it's more preference to preference, that's where you're going to get your fight and your battles. And even gospel driven change is going to have a problem. But if you're trying to just lead from preference one set to the other set of preferences, you're really going to have problems. So offer clarity, be forward in your communication. When confusion is present, church members seek out leaders who can help them understand what they need to know. Are you approachable in your leadership? Can people come to you? Okay. So clarity versus chaos. Number 6, adaptive versus inflexible. Adaptive versus inflexible. When I was in the military, we always said adapt and overcome. Another thing I love we used to say was lead, follow, or get out of the way. But adapt and overcome. That means where I've always believed this, where there is a will, there is a way. I really believe that. And so you have to be flexible though. It means that, like me in June of 2020, when we had a horrible business meeting and all those people we were trying to get out of the church to kind of clean out and get a fresh slate. And when they survived that vote, I could have thrown in the towel. I felt like throwing in the towel. What did I do though? I backed up, I adapted, and we moved forward. And eventually God gave us the ability to overcome that. But if you don't have that courage as an overseer leader to muster up that strength and lead forward, you'll never be able to lead your congregation to revitalization. So you have to learn to be flexible. Sometimes you lose, you just live to fight another day, so to speak. You've heard that phrase before, right? You lick your wounds, you let God fill your heart again with courage, and you get back up and you keep moving forward because you know that's what God has called you to do. Okay. So adaptive versus inflexible. Church leadership should be excited about regularly bringing new ideas to the church. Those who are resistant to new ideas feel pressured to change. And the statement that that is not how we do things is rarely used. Or in your context, is it the first response every time when you try to do something, when you bring a new idea? Well, we've never done it that way before, right? We often hear that. So number 7, joyful versus negative. Joyful. One of the things we push as part of our fundamental DNA here at church, one of our values is joyful, which means you are fruitful and fulfilled. It means you are serving where you are actually gifted to serve. One of the things I had to lead change in was everybody just felt forced and pressured to serve in positions, whether they were gifted for it or not, whether they felt they were needed or not. You were just said, this is what you're going to do. And so people did it out of duty, and there was no joy. And so as you know, when you get in that kind of thing, you have a lot of burnout and a high turnover. So one of the things we've tried to do is when we identify people who've been burned out of ministry, we've given them space. Hey, let it go. Step out of that for a while. Get some healing. Get your relationship with God and get your heart right, and get that joy back in your life. And so rather than always getting stage of burnout and discouragement and just ready to quit church altogether. And so here's a few thoughts on that. The church is quick to celebrate what God is doing. The church is marked by smiles and friendship and hope. Or is it despair and disgruntled and gossip? Cynical people quickly corrected and expected to change their attitude. Man, when I first got here, something negative would happen. It would go through the church faster than the internet. I mean, it was whoosh, it was all over. It was all over the internet too, before church was even over. Now there's a much healthier culture where, that's just not true. You need to go talk to pastor about that. Instead of receiving it, now people are redirecting it. And when you redirect it, how many of you know 95% of it just stops right there because they're not really interested in truth. So joyful versus negative. Number 8, quickly now. Empowering versus controlling. Empowering versus controlling. If you have to dictate and control every facet of your church ministry, you might be in the wrong line of work, truthfully. So church leaders, now, and this goes both ways. So listen to these statements. Church leaders are given the freedom to execute their ministry. On the flip side of that, after church members are given vision and direction, they are turned loose to perform the work of the ministry. So it goes both ways. Leadership needs liberty to lead, and then the congregation needs the ability to lead out and develop as leaders and ministry servants and ministry leaders in their own right as well. And that comes from trust, right? It goes back to trust. All right, number 9 here. Honesty versus deception. Honesty versus deception. A few thoughts here. Church members tell the truth about their thoughts and feelings to church leadership. And I might just add a little comma there and just say, without the fear of reprisal from leadership. So let me read that all together then. Church members tell the truth about their thoughts and feelings to church leadership, comma, without fear of reprisal from leadership. People should be able to come to you, in other words. And even if what they have to say doesn't set well with you, They ought to be able to sit in your presence, and you ought to be able to hear their heart, whether you agree with it or not, without ripping their heads off. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
And so that's part of your wise elder, part of your leadership there. Okay. Here's a great statement when it comes to empowering versus controlling. Church business meetings are rarely contentious, or are they more like World War III? All right. Number 9, honesty versus deception. Wait a minute. I already said that, didn't I? Okay, let me give you a couple more thoughts here. Personal agendas are set aside in order to fulfill the mission of the church. And the church has a culture of honesty and openness. That's where transparency, authenticity come in. So in church revitalization, we use what you see there on that page, what we call the bell curve, the bell curve. Dr. Aubrey Malphurs used to call it the sigmoid curve, I believe it was called. But here in front of you, you see on the top left quadrant, the life cycle of every church, no matter what. Then on the top right side, you have what is called perpetual revitalization. Perpetual revitalization is the most healthy form of revitalization. It means that before things get bad, you're going to reassess and you're going to realign your mission, your values, and you're going to execute. That way you stay perpetually healthy. I recommend, and I think Scott and Tim would agree with this, that every church ought to reassess itself at least every 5 to 7 years. We're leading our church through this process right now. I already have it on my master calendar to revisit our mission, our values, the health of our church as a whole in the next 5 years. And so every one of us ought to do that. We really ought to do this almost weekly, if not even daily, at some level. But when it comes to your entire church, are you looking, are you assessing, are you trying to make corrections where something is getting weak, where something has become misdirected, unaligned, some ministry leader has hijacked it and it's no longer in alignment with your mission and your values, and yet maybe you're afraid to confront or deal with that? You're going to need to realign that through a revitalization process. The bottom left is what we call revitalization, which means your church is already at a plateaued or even a declining point. A lot of churches are there. And then there are some churches that would be called a crisis revitalization, meaning they have gone, and by the way, definition of revitalization is for a church is a church that has been in decline, plateaued or declining 5 or more years. 5 or more years. So that being said, let me give you some observations about our church as we have led our church through this revitalization process. Number 1, our church, I'm talking about Ashburn, was definably a crisis revitalization. And here's why. The contributing factors were that the church had long gotten off mission and become inward focused. And these statements, by the way, are all findings from within our advisory teams, our vision and advisory teams. So this was not what I had to say about it. This is what our group assessed and analyzed ourselves, and these were our findings. Does that make sense? What we all agreed on as common findings. Church had gotten off mission and become inward focused. Number 2, the church had become dysfunctional as a result of much division, disunity, and church splits. Number 3, unkept facilities. And then number 2, the second statement, that is, Ashburn had been in decline for almost 30 years. They peaked out in 1983 and has experienced several church splits along the way. Number 3, we began the process of revitalization when I first got here, but we didn't start the formal process with Dr. Scott Foshee and Dr. Tim Rodas until about 6 months ago. But even though we had started that, the fruit of that is just now beginning to be seen in our church. So we started this process when I first got here, and here we are 3 years in, and we're just starting to see the ship turn, so to speak, and become a different church. And statistically speaking, if you've read Rainer articles, he'll say 5 to 7 years. 5 to 7 years is where you really start to catch the momentum and see things move forward. Number 4, this is what our church our leadership had to say about ourselves. we are at a pivotal moment in the church's life, and we need to be more prayerful and devoted to obedience in the same direction. So we noted that even though we've made progress, we're still at a very critical tipping point, so to speak, about the future of our church as a whole. In other words, we recognize that the decisions we're making now will affect the entire future of our church. So and this is just a case study of our church, but hopefully some of the things I've said have resonated with you. And as such, ask yourself this question: how would you assess your church based on your understanding of the church bell curve that I just illustrated? How serious would you say is the need for your church to refocus? So there's 4 different levels. Strategic would be along the lines of a perpetual revitalization, meaning you're a pretty healthy church, but you need to do some strategic things to stay healthy. Okay. So that's the lowest level of need of revitalization. Necessary means you're probably plateaued and some things need to be changing. Number 3, urgent would be you're kind of on the decline already, on the other side of that crest, and things are going down, but you want to try to change before things get really out of control to crisis level. And then immediate would be you're already in crisis mode and things are spiraling out of control, and you're trying to figure out how to get a death grip on it before it's too late. So with that question, I now want to move kind of into the conversation part of this. And if you have any general questions, but I'd like to begin with this thought. Where would you say your church is personally in that thought? Strategic, necessary, urgent, or immediate? And why would you say that? So who'd like to kick us off there? Yes, sir. Matt.
I'd put ours pretty close to immediate. It was 08, it was about 200 people. I came in last year and we had 20. And I think if they'd have gone another year or two, the doors would have closed. Now, I'm not dealing with people who are fighting back at me. I've actually got a pretty sweet group of people that I'm working with. But things need to change. We've lost all the teens who grew up in the church are not in the church, and frankly, many of them just don't want anything to do with God. And so it's just, but some things have got to happen, and I know they do.
Yeah.
So just trying to figure out what does need to happen to get that curve going. And I like what you said about that second bell curve there. It's not just keeping it going, but reassessing and continuing that
Right.
in the future.
Yep. All right. Someone else want to offer where you feel your church is without fear or reprisal?
I would say our church is in the urgent. The church of 400, Christian school is kind of running things. Christian school was asked to no longer be at the church, and the church went from 400 down to 150.
Wow.
And there's Rob Redland, everything is committee led. And I'm like, we're not going to have committee led church. So a church of 150 became a church of 100. We've got a lot of new faces in the church, which is really nice because they're on board with the vision of the church. But we have a lot of people that are still, well, we should get a committee together to decide on what kind of countertop is going to be in the new kitchen. And I'm going, no, we're not doing that. Well, I want to make a motion. No, we're not doing that. We've done our homework. Let's vote on what's already out there. So it's changing the mindsets, a lot of talk. And so when you say, is gossip dealt with? Well, it's part of the culture of our church right now. And I'm teaching through it and why you need to come to leadership. And there's plenty of people that will listen to you, and we've proven that we'll listen. We value your ideas, but you've had 2 months to come to us and you've not, and now we're in the middle of a business meeting and you want to be heard. So I would say we're probably in the urgent stage right now.
Yeah. And I've experienced about everything you've talked about. By the way, I was going to ask, did you lead the initiative on the Christian school?
No, it was done before I got there.
Okay,
Praise the
okay.
Lord. It was done before.
I didn't know if those were initiatives that you led or if it was before. Okay, gotcha. All right, someone else. This is good.
I think our church was in the necessary for revitalization, but now coming through COVID, we're now urgent. We probably lost about 30% of our drive-in crowd because of COVID. Maybe 10% of those that come back. What was unusual for us is we have lost our children and teens ministry in so much as they're there for morning worship, but not for Sunday school Bible fellowship time. Teens or, I mean, it's just numbers are drastically cut.
Yeah.
And so we're looking, how do we get that again? You know?
I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Unstuck group. Scott, do you remember the name of the guy that runs that? No, he references the Unstuck group, but they do a quarterly church health review. And the
Kinnaman.
latest one that came out for the
Kinnaman.
first,
Kinnaman, David Kinnaman.
I'm not sure that's the right name either. Tony Morgan, yeah, Tony Morgan. So their first quarter 2022 report that came out said that still, on average nationally, churches are down 30% attendance and giving. So we're talking about church revitalization, but I think we all understand while we're trying to lead revitalization, we had this little thing called the pandemic for the last 2 years that has, hit us while you're trying to lead these other initiatives to restore a healthy church. Then you have a church that's scattered during the pandemic and you're trying to regather and go through all of that while trying to lead revitalization as well. And that was us. I came 3 years ago. The last 2 years have been pandemic. So I get that and I understand that for sure. And that just adds more challenges on top of the challenges that you already have.
Can I add one quick thing?
Yes, sir.
One thing we've seen across our network here in Illinois is our churches that are primarily senior adults didn't see the big financial decline. Some of our innovative churches that have a lot of younger adults saw a bigger hit during the pandemic. But the need for revitalization with those churches, you can't if your money didn't drop, don't let that mask your need for revitalization.
Right.
So
Yeah.
That's something that we see sometimes that happens is that, your finances alone, sometimes you can have false security from your finances.
Yeah, you probably, every one of us as pastors know of another church in town or another state or whatever, that they're dead in the water, handful of people, but they don't think they need anything because they have money in the bank. Even though the church is, just a handful of people, there's no mission, no gospel mission happening there, but because they have money, they are content. And a lot of churches get stuck in that rut, and it's just it's a slow death, essentially. As long as there's money in the bank, things are okay, and they just ignore the real issues. So that's a great truth, Scott. All right, someone else. Talk about your church. Let's talk about your church. Who else? How many of you, let's change it up then. How many of you would say, I think my church is in the immediate, I'm a crisis revitalization. Let me see your hands. Let's go that route. Okay. All right. How about urgent, that you'd find your church in the urgent. Okay. How many of you say necessary? Okay. Strategic. Okay. I'd like to hear more about your strategic situation.
We have, like everybody else, come through COVID. Our senior pastor has done a good job of continually assessing and evaluating with our leadership. And one of the things that really helped us on the spiritual growth side of things was we went from Wednesday night Bible study, traditional Bible study, to growth groups. And that's really helped develop leadership. We've given us an opportunity to develop people to help facilitate those groups and bring in more people that way. And also it's grown our Wednesday night service ministry. And then on the just the planning and the calendar and the busyness side, our pastor's done a good job of getting us together to reevaluate our calendar annually and look at what we're doing and why we're doing it and filtering everything through our vision statement and through the mission of the church. I think that's helped us, and we're in the midst of the early stages of building now and expanding more classroom space and a bigger auditorium and those kind of things. So overall, we are in the place of continually trying to improve and get better, but we're not at that place where we're having to do a lot of cleanup first and a lot of foundational work.
Right.
That's pretty solid. We're just trying to keep maintaining and grow.
Yeah. that's what you're doing is optimal. You want to be constantly making adjustments year after year, assessing, adjusting, and then executing strategic small micro strategic moves in your ministry to stay at an optimal level. And you know, one of the things we talked about earlier was clarity versus chaos, or hopeful versus fearful, whatever, not being afraid to take a Wednesday night and say, you know what, this is not effective. It's just maybe it was a traditional large gathering in the worship space or whatever. Now we're gonna, what is our mission here? What is our goal? Well, our goal is to make more disciples. So let's take this Wednesday, adjust it to a night of small groups. Now you have more spiritual formation, just instead of a traditional service taking place. So that's a solid overseer-led initiative where they're realigning with their mission, and they're bringing deeper value to not only their mission, but to their disciple making part of their mission as well. So kudos on that adjustment. That's great. Okay. Someone else? Who was in the necessary? Who raised their hand and said, I'm part of a necessary where I feel like we need to do some things initially? Everybody's going to raise their hand again now. Okay. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, and our church, it's been an interesting past couple of years. So I took the pastorate right in the middle of 2020, COVID, so that was kind of fun. And then I don't know, I mean, so our primary focus was just to kind of return Bible preaching emphasis, and God has really done an incredible work there. It's been really exciting. So obviously I was in the other session earlier. We're still trying to kind of hammer out our exact mission statement, purpose statement, but you know, it's been evident that God has had his hand on this, and so it's been exciting. So I put it in the necessary category just because, you know, there are still a couple holdouts from the way things have previously been done, that we're praying that God's going to continue to change hearts as we see the culture change.
What are some of the other areas you feel that need to change, that need revitalization, in other words, in that context? You mentioned to return to biblical type preaching.
Yeah.
What else would you add into that need for revitalization necessary?
I mean, one of the major things, we were just kind of dead. There was not, the spirit of the church was not, I mean, people were just going through the motions. And I think a lot of us maybe kind of relate to that. I feel like there's a definite purpose in when we get together again, which is exciting for us. You know, we have purpose in why we meet. Now, there's still a lot of other things that need to be ironed out though with that. Like, you know, we're still looking and talking about what to do with Sunday night church, right? Are we just going to continue to do Sunday nights because it's what we've always done? So stuff like that. I mean, those are some of the smaller things. But I mean, we're continuing to work on the spirit of some of our people that have remained, which has been exciting. But some of them still like to have bad attitudes about whatever, you know, variety of issues.
Yeah. So I keep hearing COVID come into the conversation. We're talking about church revitalization, but COVID keeps coming up as part of this, obviously, because we just came through 2 years of the pandemic. So one question I'd like to ask you some feedback from you guys on is, how has COVID, for better or worse, impacted your ability to lead revitalization in your context? Anybody want to speak into that? Again, for better or worse, has it hindered or has it actually helped in some ways lead some revitalization? Yes, sir.
Well, it's been helpful, I think, for me, at least for two fronts. I've been at the church when COVID all started for about 3 years. And it definitely revealed problems that I was not aware of, in the sense of like probably some attitude stuff. And then also other people rose to the occasion. So in some ways it was a fast forward, I feel like, getting us to the point where we're ready to move forward. And this last year has been really good in that regard. So I would throw us an urgent, but I feel like we're going the right direction in that. But COVID was very trying emotionally. It was very trying and a lot of stress I would say, me personally, and not so much in the church's side, but probably on me personally. And it was helpful in the way that God, all trials should be helpful in edifying our church, unified in a greater way. And I think got more focused. But I know our big need, and I like the wording that was used in yours, was figuring out the pace of revitalization that we're in. So, so yeah, I mean, COVID brought some difficulties, but I think it also brought some good blessings for us in our case.
Yeah. Praise the Lord. Anybody else want to address that? COVID for better or worse? Yes, sir.
I think one of the good things we've learned is the importance of the community of the local church. Because I think if, depending on where you're from, or I'm from Washington State, and so we had some pretty heavy restrictions on us. And so during that time when you're not meeting in person, there's a sense of a lack of, that people's faith begin to dwindle. And I know people that, I mean, they walked away from the faith during it because they didn't have their community to help them during that time. And so I think one of the things that's brought up is how important community is and face to face. And so one of the things we've shifted towards is really we call them life groups, our community groups, but really focusing on strengthening those groups, because who knows if it doesn't happen again. I mean, it's very likely it could, right? And you want the church to continue to be strong. And so I think it was something that we learned through COVID.
Yeah. Amen.
I'm a lay leader in our church, but I feel like COVID had a really interesting effect for us in that we were, a lot of people found us online that came to our church, said, "Hey, we heard about your online service." People at work said, "Hey, jump on our online services." And then in the summer we had services outside, so people would go by our church and see, 300 people sitting on the parking lot, and we set up tents and did all this stuff. So we had so many people. I just had a really sharp couple Sundays. Yeah, we joined that summer during that. We went by and saw your church outside and just pulled in. So I think that's interesting. I felt like too, I lead some small groups, and I felt people were far more willing to share in like online polls, chats, things like that during our, online meetings than they were in person. In other words, especially young people, be willing to be honest about things that I was really, really surprised about. So I feel like there was a part of that revitalization, I think is so critical. Our church was growing going into this. We were really starting to really surge going into COVID, but I'm glad we're talking about this. I think it's so necessary, even the strategic part, like it's every, so many years going through that. I can imagine what would have happened had we gone back 20 years in these ministries and had a cycle of that, how much more we'd be, building the kingdom and be prevalent in our communities. So it's awesome.
Amen.
What's your name?
Joe Crawford.
Joe?
Yes.
Joe Crawford. Are you, you said you're a lay leader?
Yes.
Is your pastor here or is it?
He actually was on his way here this morning. His wife taught one of the sessions. His son got violently ill this morning. So his wife was speaking, so he stayed back. And we were in Vegas last week together, last year together.
Why did you come to IDA?
My wife and I we lead Reignite, which is a college age group in our church, and started the ministry 4 years ago. We're running about, between 15 and 25. And so we're just looking for opportunities, some ideas to plug these people in, man. And there's a massive gap in our Christian churches today between high school, youth group, awesome. They go off to college, they just disappear.
Right.
And maybe they get married and come back to it. But we found a really exciting group of people, man. And I went right to atheist.org. The first day I was there, I said, "Listen, guys, it's either real or it's not. If it's not real, let's go get drunk. Let's go have fun. Who cares, right? We're gonna die tomorrow. But this isn't real. This book isn't real. Let's can the whole thing. I'm out." I said, if it is, man, let's find out who he is. Let's draw near to him and feel his power and watch him flex his mighty arms. They were kind of like, and I was in tears in my eyes, like, let's get this thing. And so I've just found God come around that group, and I went right to atheist.org. We're gonna jump on them. We're gonna take them one at a time, man. We're just gonna knock them over the fence. I was really disappointed. They were really they weren't very creative, but that's why we're here, is to find better ideas and ways to reach these kids. And
I just feel, if I may, just to share a couple things. I'm a church planner, so I'm not in this room because I respect so much of what you do to go into a church and revitalize. That takes a lot of effort, a lot of work. So I say that to say this: I have no authority in this room. I just have a voice. Your gifts are so beyond me. If I went into a church to revitalize, I would probably burn it down. Right? Just because of my giftings and wiring personality. So it's easier, you've probably heard it before, to give birth than to raise the dead. And that's for me. But I just feel like to say in this room, if I could put courage in you, or to encourage you. That's what that means, to put courage in you. Just to say, borrow some of, my audacity. I'm not trying to be proud. I'm just saying, like, just blow it up. What's the worst that could happen? Do something, the craziest idea. What's the worst that can happen? You might lose a job. That's probably the worst that can happen. But if God's called you to be there, he's gonna find something else for you, right? And again, I have no authority, I just have a voice. I just want to share this to put courage in you. And just do something that's crazy, that's audacious, that's big, faith, dream big. I will not insult God with small thinking and safe living. No, I'm gonna risk the ocean. I'm gonna risk
Good.
everything. And so if I just say that, just to encourage you.
It's good, Akeem.
There's people like him.
Yeah.
Lay in the church, lay leaders, and they want to blow it up. They
Yeah.
want to see God do incredible things. So. you have to do it.
Yeah. Doubtless one of the most critical elements of church revitalization is just boldness. Just being crazy enough to believe that what God has called you to do. I mean, calling me from Tampa, Florida to Chicago required crazy boldness to just come to a place I've never been. I tell everybody, you might as well have shipped me to China because the culture change was just that drastic. But we came because, number one, we knew God called us and we knew what God called us to do. He would equip us to do. And so we've stayed. We've had some difficult days, but we're still here and we believe the best days are ahead of us. And that's, if I could encourage all of you guys, no matter where you're at in that revitalization curve, no matter where you're at on that sphere, it requires bold leadership. And so I want to encourage you. Any other questions? We got about 2 minutes here.
Walter's
I'm
got one.
gonna run off of what Akeem just said. What do you do when you've tried blowing it up in the past and it actually blew up? Or nothing, just nothing happened. And you get to the point where you're just, at that point, you become a plotter. You just plod along and you're a little leery about blowing it up again.
My response to that would be, I don't believe you're never closer to victory than you are in that moment. I was there in June of 2020. Deb Morgan's a member of our church. She can tell you that was a very despondent business meeting, wasn't it? It was the worst experience of my adult ministry life. And it was a moment where I felt like any little light at the end of the tunnel just was gone completely. But in that moment, I think I told you, my student pastor and I went to lunch on that Friday, and we just looked at each other and said, God's got this. We're going to make big strides. And out of that birthed the replant of Chicago, the plant of our Arabic ministry, all of the revitalization we've led here at Orland. And I mean, Satan rather had us right there at that precipice of just shutting down completely. And yet, and I can never tell you how I mustered the strength to rally back after that, other than just God.
Right.
But because we did, our church is a completely different church today, much healthier church, a much more joy-filled church. Doesn't mean all of our challenges are behind us, but God is leading us faithfully through that. I can tell you this, and my response could come across as maybe even a little trite, but fear is never the right answer. Because you've been hurt before once, 10 times, not being afraid to take another step of faith is never the right response, if that makes sense.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, sir.
Well, especially for guys, smaller churches. I think it's vitally important that you purposely build brotherhood. We have small groups and we say, hey, let's have community, but somebody has to build community. And somebody has to build brotherhood. For me, I'm an extreme introvert, so I'm okay not talking to people. But one of the exercises I did one day is I sat down and I wrote a list of guys in my area that I could purposely go have lunch with on a regular basis. So I would say, find people near you that you can fellowship with outside of your church, other pastors, to be an encourager in the middle of the revitalization process as well. And the thing is, you may not always need the encouragement, but if your little group grows, somebody's going to need it on some day that you're there, and you're going to be that encourager for them. If nothing else, you can pray and go to the King of Kings and get encouragement together.
Good word.
Let me add one thing to his point. That's Stanley, you say that, blowing things up sounds sexy until you blow it up, it blows up in your face.
Yeah.
Okay, and any of us who've done those things have experiences just like that. And it goes back to you, your leadership needs to have bought in. I mean, it's like there's different versions of blowing up. I'm gonna blow it up because I got an attitude, I'm irritated, you know, we can make it sound like it's gonna be this wonderful thing, God's gonna do whatever, but people's flesh, people's insecurities, demonic's always at work, you know, he's always attacking, and it doesn't take much. I mean, you can read in the Bible, right? But sometimes in the middle of those blow-ups, or in the middle of the times when it feels like it hasn't worked, just go back and look at some of those Old Testament Bible stories. You know, the Zerubbabel comes back to rebuild the temple, and then they stop him, and for 14 years, there's no work on the temple. What happened? Was God not at work then? I mean, you know what I'm saying? So sometimes you're in the middle of something that looks like the dream died, or the idea died, or it's not going to happen. And I just say there's just continue that, persevere, you know, like was it long obedience in the same direction, just continue to persevere. And sometimes it looks like patience. You know, sometimes it looks like I'm not doing anything, but you have to trust that God is doing something. And I take a lot of comfort in some of the Old Testament Bible stories where I see things that took, or it seemed like it blew up, and God was there the whole time. You know, then when all the pieces come together, it's like, oh, that's what that was about. You know, so don't get discouraged. It sounds cool to say something, blow something up. That sounds awesome.
Right.
But I got scars.
And don't leave revitalization alone. You need a close relationship with God, and like you said, it's going to put brothers and sisters around you in your church and from other churches. And that's why it's important to have places like this, and ask God to provide that. Because if you're not willing to seek God and others for help, there's no help. There's no hope for revitalization in you, because you've got to be obedient, and realize you're not all that in a bag of chips, right? And let Jesus live his life through you.
Yeah, we have some online stuff, Jerry.
Yeah, one came in, this was an immediate need from Walter as far as revitalization. He said our former pastor died of COVID, was very afraid for his life and those in the church. We also had a church split just afterward that was hidden by COVID. What would you say to Walter? Because he's kind of running the ship right now in the aftermath of that. What's something you or anyone in the room would say to Walter?
Well, actually, Walter and I have had a lot of one-on-one conversation, so I understand some of his story. But he's like everybody, regardless of the specific circumstances. We're all leading, you know, coming out of COVID, and especially on top of that, if you're leading in a context of needing church revitalization, it just seems like the mountain's on you more than you get to experience the mountaintop moments. But I think it goes back to what Scott was saying in his session about the wise elder, the overseer, and the shepherd continuing to fulfill those giftings and stay faithful. And as Tim just said, stay patient, stay perseverant. And even when we think God's not working, God is working. And that's, Tim, that was, I love you, man.
I love you, brother.
I love you, man.
You still can't have my Bud Light.
But that's why ministry is what it is. You know, it's a bearing the burden. It's a having wisdom as a wise elder, the heart of a shepherd for broken and hurting people. But then when it's required, that bold visionary leadership to lead church revitalization. Yep. Good.
Yep.
All right, guys, we're out of time. And Deb has faithfully been holding up the placards over there. And is there evaluations? Is that what that means?
Yes.
Point at that. They're asking you to fulfill the evaluation. Give me 5-star ratings, please. And we're all good. Thank you.
Those of you joining online, thanks for being with us today. We will be live 2 p.m. Eastern next Tuesday. Carrie Schmidt will be with us. You do not want to miss what Carrie Schmidt has to say. See you guys next week.